All right, so we're going to do our best, regardless of poor lighting, or in this case, really good lighting that ends up being a negative. So, chapter 10, Western Europe. Western Europe is a bit odd, and it's also kind of broad. There are a lot of different places that we can talk about when we talk about Western Europe. And you guys named a bunch of them during the reading quiz. We could talk about Spain and Portugal. We could talk about England and France. We can talk about Germany in the areas of, what we kind of call Central Europe. There are a lot of different places that today we recognize as independent countries. But at the time, Western Europe is probably a little bit more culturally uniform, but at the same time very, very segregated. And I realize those are kind of conflicting descriptions, and hopefully it'll make more sense as we go through. But let's look at some of the basic characteristics, just like we do with all the other civilizations when we're first introduced to them. One of the things we find about Western Europe, and this has been true ever since the classical period, there's lots of invasions. Now, any guesses why I put India in parentheses next to it? It's a comparison, because it's just like India. Now, what are some of the invasions that we've seen so far in Western Europe? All right, from the Muslims invading up through Spain and Portugal. What else? The Vikings. What else? And you can even go back further to the classical age. Not the Mongols. The Turks into Byzantium, not necessarily all the way into Western Europe, but certainly into Eastern Europe. Who invaded Rome? The Germanic barbarians. How about the Huns? All right, so there's been lots of invasions throughout Western Europeans' history. And just like we saw with India, what do invasions cause, especially when they happen rather frequently? What's the impact on a civilization or on an area that's subject to lots of invasions? All right, oftentimes reliance on religion, certainly an impact on government, and government tends to go one of two ways, either strong and central or weak and regional, because the central government keeps getting overthrown. One of the two usually seems to happen. And in Western Europe's case, they're going to go the same route that India did. Because of all these invasions, and because of, more importantly, the rivalries between these different kingdoms in Western Europe, you're going to see very weak regional authority, but absolutely no central authority. So we will not have a unified Western Europe until we get to today with the European Union. Prior to that point, each of the countries that we typically think of in Western Europe, France, England, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, are actually going to be divided up into small kingdoms. Kind of like how if you took the state of Virginia, you could divide it up into what? Counties. So even though they all fall within the same political border, you have all these different counties that have different personalities. And so what this means when we talk about Western Europe is that we need to be very, very aware of the fact that there's a lot of diversity. And so kind of in the same way that we talked about Africa, where we want to be careful about lumping everyone in Western Europe together, there are places in Western Europe that are fairly developed, fairly civilized, fairly advanced, and there are places in Western Europe that are just plain backwards, underdeveloped. And so this is going to be our challenge as we go through chapter 10, and this is going to be your challenge as you read chapter 10, trying to make sense of all the different places that they talk about. And this is going to be the pattern in your textbook going forward, is that as they continue to deal with regions of the world, those regions are going to become more and more subdivided. We no longer get to have nice, easy chapters where the entire thing's about China and everything in China is the same. Now we're going to talk about Western Europe, but we're going to talk about 5 different places in Western Europe, and each one's going to be a little bit different. All right, good on the first slide? Yes? Okay. All right. Last year you guys learned about feudalism, right? You've heard the word before? Okay. Feudalism oftentimes gets used incorrectly. And so this is something that we're going to attempt to fix today. It's helping you understand the correct usage of feudalism and learning a new word, manorialism, which oftentimes gets replaced by feudalism. And so we're going to pull a definition for manorialism straight from your book. The system of economic and political relations between landlords and peasant laborers. What sort of relationship does this sound like if you put it in present day language? Exactly. A boss and his employees. This is an economic arrangement. The peasant laborers are hired to work for their landlord employer. And just like bosses today, they provide the wage and they provide, benefits, protection from huge outrageous hospital bills because they give you insurance. And so manorialism is where the landlords offer protection to their peasant laborers, keep them safe from invading marauders. If the river floods, help protect the village, things like that. And in exchange, the peasant laborers do the work. Now, what kind of work are they doing?
Farming.
They're farming. They're growing crops. And so when those crops are harvested, who's going to get the majority of it? The landlord. Because it's the landlord's land. It's his stuff they're producing. Now, sometimes this could be a very happy, healthy, functioning relationship between landlord and peasant. Sometimes the peasants would actually like the landlord. Sometimes the landlord would actually like the peasants. They'd even send each other Christmas cards. Other times, this was an incredibly hostile and abusive or even neglectful relationship, where the peasants would work in squalor. They would work in, horrible housing conditions with minimal tools and technology, and life would be very, very unpleasant. Feudalism, on the other hand, is the term that we often use to cover this entire spectrum of relationships. But feudalism really is much more specific. Feudalism really is the political and military relationship between the different landlords. So looking at it from a 21st century standpoint, this would be the relationship between, let's say, all the different owners of, Shell gas stations compared to the president of Shell. We're not worried here about the lowly employees at this point. This is simply a relationship amongst the elites. But it looks very similar, and that's why we often get confused. Because here again, you have the same system of obedience and protection in place. The lower elites swear fealty. They swear an oath, oftentimes called an oath of fealty. They make a promise, the little guys do, to obey whoever the most powerful landlord is in that area. Whoever's the biggest and the strongest, or the smartest, or has the most land and is therefore the wealthiest, or the guy with the biggest army, or best hair, I don't know, whatever. Pick your qualification. And so the little guys swear fealty to the most powerful one, agreeing to obey him. And in return, the most powerful one essentially keeps the peace in that area. Now, each one of these landlords has their own little tiny kingdom. Each one of these landlords craves more land, because getting more land would give him what? More money and more power. So each one of these landlords is aggressive. Each one of these landlords desires more. So if there is no top landlord, what probably happens between all of these small kingdoms? They're going to fight with each other, non-stop, all day long. Maybe this is more like a parent and child relationship. What happens if you've got 6 siblings in the house and the parents aren't there? Sheer chaos? Things get broken, right. So without this top feudal lord, Western Europe descends into chaos. But how come we never then get a centralized, powerful government that unites all of Western Europe? What's holding them back from this? John? Exactly. Everybody wants to be the top person. But for one person to become the top person, what would have to happen? All right, you'd have to fight everybody else, or everybody else would have to voluntarily support you. How hard do you think that's going to be to happen? Especially if all of them want this power in the first place. And so this is why we say that this feudal system, it keeps the peace to an extent because it stops the fighting amongst all the children. But at the same time, it prevents Western Europe from unifying. It limits the development of more centralized control because everyone is focused on their own regional feudal loyalties. If I have to be obedient to my feudal lord, if I have sworn an oath of fealty, I'm going to keep that promise between him and me. But if he wants to ever gain more power, he's going to have to overthrow the next kingdom over and beat the guy that's at his level next door. Because that guy is never going to step down. So if we put it in context like this, James is king of Stirling. Yeah. And within the kingdom of Stirling, we have 3 landlords. The landlord of Potomac Falls, the landlord of Dominion, the landlord of Parkview. Now, are there any conditions under which this group over here would agree to unite with the king of Western Loudon and the landlords of Loudon Valley and Tuscarora? Any conditions under which they're going to agree to join forces? No, because what's the first thing that's going to happen between the king of Stirling and the king of Western Loudon? Right, who's going to have the power? And it's not like James is going to show up and Allison's going to be like, you know what, James, you're such a better king than me. And James is like, no, really, you are. You're such a better ruler. You should have the power. And Allison's like, oh, stop. That's not going to happen. So the only way this works is if they fight. If they invade each other and they spend their resources and they spend their time and they engage their soldiers for this battle. And at that point, look at what they've won. They've won this much more land than they've had before. And now they're weak and exhausted and poor from the fighting. Plus, now you guys that used to work for Queen Allison are pissed because you don't like the new king. So now what do you spend all your time doing? Right, plotting to overthrow him in revolt. And so it sends us right back into this cycle of regional conflict and regional loyalty. And that's why Western Europe never digs themselves out of it. That's all feudalism. What's manorialism? It's the landlord and the peasants. Completely separate issues, but with terms that oftentimes get confused with each other. So are we in a better place now with this? Yes? All right, any questions? Do we understand now why we say political power in Western Europe is very regional? Okay. No confusion here. Yes? Well, the issue with manorialism is it can be a really good relationship where the peasants like the landlord and the landlord takes good care of the peasants, or it can be the kind of thing where the landlord works the peasants to death, barely gives them any food, and they live in shacks. Yeah. Yes, and that's why the terms often get confused. Manorialism is kind of like feudalism on a smaller scale. It's the peasants obeying the landlord, swearing fealty to him, and the landlord then providing protection for the peasants. So you're right, it's like a microcosm of the feudal system. Emily? Yep. Yep. Yes, exactly. So like your book says, system of economic and political relationships. So like Alana says, it's that like microcosm of feudalism. But manorialism is primarily economic. Feudalism is primarily political.
So can you have manorialism in feudalism?
Yes.
Like within it?
Yes. And they usually come as a package deal, because if you have feudalism, you have these small kingdoms, and the only way that small kingdoms function is by controlling the land, and then what do you do with the land? You use manorialism and have the peasants farm it. So it really is kind of a package deal. All right, the military component of feudalism. We have our King of Stirling, who wants to go invade the Queen of Western Loudon. Who does he get to help him in this fight? Right. King of Potomac Falls, or the landlord of Potomac Falls, landlord of Dominion, landlord of Parkview. Hey, each of you go round up 50 peasants. We'll raise an army of 200 people because I'll get 50 of my peasants as well. Bring all your buddies that like to, fight on the weekends. And we're going to go invade them. And you have to do it because I told you to, and I'm at the top of this feudal system in this kingdom. Does that make sense? Okay. Emily? They're like kings in the sense that they rule over a unified area. But that area is not going to be like all of France. It's going to be one corner of it. Same reason they're not going to get along, because one of them is going to have to either voluntarily step down or defeat the other, and then still have the power to move on to the next kingdom and defeat that. And so what we're going to see is that only happens a couple of times, that somebody is able to take over that much. In terms of like, In some cases, like a large kingdom would probably be like, everything that's included in the city of Sterling, which I know seems small to you guys because then you have an entire country to look at it in perspective. But if you think about the fastest mode of transportation being walking or on horseback, how long would it take you to get from the Bloom over here on Algonquian all the way out to Route 28? It'd take you a while, right? So that's why you're not going to see huge, massive kingdoms, because it takes so long to get from one end to the other. To get from here down to Sterling Park. I mean, that's a couple hours worth of walking. Other questions? All right. For those that need a visual, here's the visual. Manorial Ism, it's the economic aspect of the Lord and the people that work his land. Feudalism, you have the lesser lords swearing fealty to the most powerful. All right, quick look at economy. We see very, very, very little trade between kingdoms. Why? Because they don't like each other. Because there's a rivalry. And so most of these kingdoms have to be fairly self-sufficient. As farming gets better, it's just like we talked about with early civilizations. As farming improves, as you get a food surplus, what gets to happen? Specialization of labor, increased population, better government. Again, remember, much of Western Europe is behind. So we almost have to go through the basic stages of civilization in some parts of Western Europe. Even though we had a Roman Empire in Western Europe, there are parts of it that the Romans never touched, and that were still essentially hunter-gatherers. And so some parts of Western Europe are going through this process of learning to be a civilization from the very beginning. Over time, though, and maybe this isn't surprising, some of the places that already had civilization will leap ahead and start to do some of the things that we've seen happen in China and in India. What was the center of the Roman Empire? Geographically. Rome. And so maybe it's not surprising then that Italy will become one of the more developed Western European countries, and they will be the people that start to engage in trade outside of Western Europe. And because we always talk about merchants, because merchants are apparently interesting, I don't know why. When we talk about how society views merchants in Western Europe, who do you think they end up being most similar to? China. Which is weird, because so far Western Europe has looked a whole lot like India. But because of Christian teachings, because of what Christianity says about the accumulation of wealth, which is basically that you can't take it with you, and that you need to give up worldly things, Western Europe doesn't look that favorably on merchants. It's better than China. I mean, in China, they're really looked down on. They are really criticized for their lifestyle choice. In Western Europe, I mean, nobody's going to throw rotten fruit at them or anything, but it's still not necessarily the dream profession. Merchants are viewed as inherently distrustful. It's assumed that Western European merchants are trying to cheat you, that they're kind of shifty. So they're tolerated, they're necessary, just like most every other place. They are not necessarily valued. How are we doing so far? Other than tired. Now, for how many of you does this all seem a little weird? This isn't the Western Europe you were expecting to hear about. Like, we've always thought Western Europe is this really amazing, civilized place where all these good ideas have come from. No. Okay, well, if you didn't think that, then that's good. But oftentimes, especially being in the United States, where we came from Western European nations, we have this great respect for all things European. And we think of places like England and France and Italy as these major cultural centers that for hundreds of years have been coming up with the best ideas in the world. And so that's why some students struggle with this chapter in the book, is because it's just dashing all of these dreams to nothing. Because it turns out that Western Europe really wasn't that great for a long time.
How rapidly it excelled at, or how good it excelled at rapidly building the club.
Well, it definitely is something to then take a look at and see, well, look how much they've done in just the last 500 or 600 years. But it also then makes us look at our bias a little bit and go, all right, why did we always assume Western Europe was so great if it's only been in the last couple hundred years that they have been? Because we came from there.
And then you look at the US.
Well, there's certainly lots of bias there as well, especially for a country that's so young. But we oftentimes lose sight of the fact that places like China have been civilized for, 4,000 years? All right. Society. What does our social hierarchy look like in Western Europe? Pretty simple, actually. 3 levels. And you could make an argument that it's 2 levels. You've got the people at the top, which are the people that fight and the people that pray. So you got the nobles and the clergy, the church. Those are your elites. Why do nobles have power? What do they have that gives them power? Land. Land which gives them wealth. In fact, in the Middle Ages, land equals wealth because land gives you food. There were many, many, many Western European nobles that, from a monetary standpoint, were poor, that did not have much tangible gold and silver in their treasuries. But because they had hundreds of acres of land, well, not that they would trade that, but that land gives them food, and food is power, right? Because food is survival. Right. Now, what gives the church power? God, right? Because based on Catholic teachings, priests get to talk to God, and God talks to priests, and then priests relay that message to everybody else. And since Western Europe is a predominantly Christian society at this point, most people are completely focused on not only living this life on earth, but more importantly, getting ready for what? Getting ready for heaven. And so if the focus of your life is getting ready for the afterlife, who do you desperately need? You need the priests. You need the instructions. Because what might happen without the instructions? You might not go where you're expecting to go. So this is what gives the nobles and the clergy the right to be at the top of the social hierarchy. The nobles own the land. Land gives you food. Food is survival. And priests own God. They own the access to God, which is survival for the next life. And what's really interesting about this in Western Europe is that oftentimes the nobles and the clergy are related, like came from the same families. Which means we need to talk for just a moment about the concept of inheritance. So let's say that all of you are born into noble families. You guys over here, all 9 of you, are born into the same noble family. The same set of parents. 9 kids. Aren't they lucky? And the same over here. The 10 of you. Same parents. And the same over here. All 9 of you. 9 and 10 member families would not be terribly uncommon. What would be uncommon is that you would all survive. Many of you would probably die off by the age of 2 or 3 from any one of a variety of diseases that nobody knew how to fix. So half of each of your group is now dead. Yes?
Would that have been solved by better hygiene practices available at the time or not?
Not just hygiene, but hygiene certainly would have helped, yeah.
But I mean, would have been able to help much more if they using technology that had available at the time and taking care of themselves better.
Well, that was the problem. They didn't have the technology at the time to take better care because running water was not really a viable option for most people. And so regular bathing and hand washing and drinking water and cleaning their food and things like that was simply too hard to do given the limited availability of water. Most people are going to take a bath about once a month. Yes. Because that's how often they can justify going to the nearest lake or pond or stream or river and bringing the water all the way back and heating it in kettles over fires and then putting it in a bathtub to bathe in. And then once the first person's done, somebody else jumps into the same water because otherwise you got to lug all that water back and heat it all up again. So taking a bath is a several-hour process unless you have people to do it for you. So anyway, half of you are all now dead. There's only 4 or 5 of you left in each family. Who is going to inherit this title of nobility and assume control of this land when your parents die? John? The oldest son.
There are no sons.
Now, in some cases, you may have a female child that is allowed to assume control, provided that she has shown herself to be highly intelligent, probably a little bit ruthless. But for the most part, it's going to be the men. What does this mean for all the other siblings? What do you guys now do for a job? And keep in mind that you are nobles, so you're not going to go get a 9-to-5 job. All right, you may work for your brother. What kind of work might you do that is socially acceptable but still provides you with an acceptable quality of living? Well, the only way you can become a vassal is if you have land of your own. So go take somebody's land, right? Okay. You could go to the church. And this is why so often the nobles and the clergy are related, because the clergy will be the younger siblings of the nobles, the people that had no land or power to inherit, and they had to do something else, but they still want a nice cushy life. Going to work for the church provided that opportunity, because you'd get to live in a nice cathedral. You'd get to wear nice clothes, because you can't have the priests that are up in front of everybody on Sunday wearing shabby rags. You're going to have access to good food, because again, you are the public image of God. You cannot be malnourished. And of course, your parishioners, the people that attend your church, are going to be so grateful to you for your spiritual guidance that they will provide you with all sorts of comforts and gifts and tangible signs of their thanks and appreciation. You do have to learn to read, although actually you don't. One of the problems with the church in Western Europe heading into the Renaissance is that a number of them were illiterate. And so at that point, the stories in the Bible became an oral tradition.
Wow.
And so the stories of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Moses and Noah and the ark would be things that were learned through repetition and became an oral tradition, rather than something that was... They would still have the Bible open in front of them on Sundays. They couldn't read it. Especially because what language is it in? Latin. So, those are our elites. The people that control the land and the people that control God.
Question then.
Sure.
Is that like turned into an oral tradition? How the like just the anecdotes or the sermon came into being like eventually?
Right. Because you have to have a way to verbally translate a message from a person who may be illiterate to a congregation that is almost certainly illiterate.
So
That's where the stained glass windows become so important, because it's a visual portrayal of the stories, because they can't read it.
the oral telling story could eventually morph and start into like anecdotes and whatnot that they're told as well.
Yeah. All right, so then we get to the people at the bottom. So again, we really have two classes. We have the elites and we have everybody else. About 2% and about 98%, if we're going to break up population. And that 98% are the peasants and the serfs, craftspeople, things like that. And again, like we discussed in the reading quiz, serf does not mean slave. Serfs can own property. Serfs do have certain basic rights. That doesn't mean necessarily they won't get beaten. It doesn't mean they might not have their land taken from them if their landlord feels the serf is not meeting their obligations. Being a peasant, being a serf is certainly not a desirable occupation.
But it's not as bad as being a slave in some parts of the world.
Right. All right, other things we find in Western Europe. Again, this will hopefully be a statement of the obvious, but there is no single unifying language. It's all the different dialects that we see today, plus some more. Yes, sir. It might be a more educated version of the language. You know, the way that like a college professor might speak English is different from the way that you guys walking through the hallways of high school speak English, if for no other reason than the word like appears far less often. But no, I mean, there's no elite language that's different. Again, unless you're in the church, nobody's really going to remember Latin. Many of them will not have studied the classics, and so they won't know Greek or Hebrew or anything like that. And many of them, because of the rivalries between kingdoms, would not necessarily take the time to learn, you know, the language of the next country over. So people in England would not necessarily be fluent in French, and people in Spain would not necessarily be fluent in Portuguese. You know, things like that. And again, that's going to be one of the things that makes it hard to unify Western Europe. There's just too much going on. And if any of you guys have ever traveled in Europe, when you go from one country to the next, it's hard to communicate. When I took kids this summer, we started in Portugal, then we went to Spain, then we went to France. If you don't speak the language in the place that you're going to, you can get through. And we've had this talk before. You know, you can point and you can grunt and you can, you know, make shapes with your hands and things like that. But it's really hard to communicate. And because, even though there is some commonality between these languages, they're different enough that unless you know the language, it's very hard to interact. Which is going to make it very hard then to create these relationships between Western European countries. Again, other things that should make sense now that we've talked about where people are. If 98% of your population are serfs and peasants, where do most people live? In the city or in the country? All right, they live on the farms in the country. So let's take a look at how Western Europe compares to other parts of the world. If we look at the urban population of Western Europe, 5% of all the people anywhere in Western Europe live in a quote-unquote city. If you compare that with Asia combined, throughout Asia, 15% of all of Asia's population, including China, including India, 15% of their people live in cities. So it gives you a sense of just how dependent Western Europe is on agriculture. And then if we look at the cities themselves, there are very, very few cities in Western Europe at this time that have anything more than 100,000 people. China by itself had over 52 cities of 100,000 plus people. So again, just to give you kind of a spatial sense of where people are. Yes, sir.
So, did China, I know it says all Asian civilizations, so that how it averaged out a bit between them.
Mm-hmm.
But does that mean that, but when looking at the number of cities, I'm thinking China had more than 15% urban population?
Right. Yeah, that's probably a fair assumption. All right. We're going to stop torturing you guys.